far more a blessing for all of us. And I think we should, perhaps, if we're going to dwell on anything, dwell on that.
Live from Washington, Crossfire. On the left, Mike Kinsley. On the right, John Sununu. Tonight, dedicated in the Crossfire, Democratic Senator Patrick Leahy of Vermont. In Los Angeles, David Horowitz, president of the Center for the Study of Popular Culture. And in New York, Anthony DeCurtis, editorial director for VH1.
Good evening, welcome to Crossfire. Jerry Garcia died yesterday, and today it was already clear that this is going to rank up there as an important cultural event like the death of Elvis and the assassination of John Lennon. For 3 decades, Garcia's band, the Grateful Dead, symbolized the 1960s counterculture, especially in recent years when most other aspects of the counterculture sank into ancient history. Yesterday, Dead fans gathered in city parks across the country and overloaded the internet with their mourning and reminiscences. The Dead brought joy to millions and actually gave meaning to life for thousands of so-called deadheads who followed them around the world from concert to concert. On the other hand, and this is Crossfire after all, is a hero of the counterculture worth celebrating or mourning? Jerry Garcia was a heavy user of LSD and heroin. He died of a heart attack at a drug rehab center. He was 53. Some amazing people turn out to be deadheads, but not John Sununu. He's a golf head. John?
Senator Leahy, I assume you're here as a lover of the music of the Grateful Dead, but I can't imagine you're here endorsing them as a constructive representation of the cultural period that they came out of.
I enjoy the music very much. I knew Jerry Garcia. I was very impressed with his artistry. I was very impressed with him individually, conversations I had with him, and obviously feel the sense of mourning of his family and his wife and his children. And of course the remarkable musicians, all the others who were in that in the band. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Enjoyed their music when I was a district attorney in my 20s. I enjoy their music today as a senator in my 50s.
Certainly the 30 years, over 3 decades that they spanned, is a period of time when a lot of things changed. And unfortunately, a lot of folks point to the Grateful Dead and say one thing that didn't change that perhaps should have was them giving credibility to a drug culture, and as they matured, should they not have at least drawn the line and identified that they were a negative?
I say that they just gave credibility to it. I mean, I think that a number of them probably did do drugs and were working hard and do not. Jerry Garcia obviously was in a drug rehab place, but to equate everybody in that is a different thing. During the time when they were first starting, I was prosecuting people for using drugs. I have prosecuted a lot of people for using drugs. I don't believe in that, but I do like their music. It's just like I can say that I think the world of Van Gogh paintings, but I'm not going to cut off my ear just because Van Gogh cut off his ear.
Senator, there's a whole generation out there that if you asked them to identify the one group most identified with the drug culture, would have pointed their finger at the Grateful Dead.
There's a whole lot of others. You could, Jimi Hendrix, who died of overdose. You could do a whole lot of Elvis Presley, of course.
But they never had the
Elvis Presley, who died of abuse of drugs. But then you have to ask, why do you listen to the music? Do you listen to music because you want to go out and do drugs? Or do you have somebody who may be doing drugs anyway?
Mr. DeCurtis in New York, the Crossfire audience may be a rather large segment of the population, many of whom are not exactly au courant about Jerry Garcia. Explain to our audience, for that matter, explain to John, for that matter, explain to me, what was so great about the Grateful Dead musically?
Well, the thing about them musically that was really interesting was that there was a sense of spontaneity about them, which in many ways is disappearing from popular music and many forms of classical music as well. There was a sense at any moment on stage, anything can happen. It was spontaneous, it was alive, it was responsive to the audience. That's part of the communal feel that they created. People went there every time to have an experience, not to get a package show or to get something that was, you know, just kind of pre-blown for them. This was something that happened right at the moment on stage.
But is the enormous impact they seem to have on so many people solely attributable to their music, or is there something else involved?
No, there was a larger culture. In many ways, they are an example of a group that made the counterculture mainstream. I mean, yesterday, after Garcia died, Wall Street came to a close because the computer system crashed because these brokers were trading messages about it. These are not tax and spend liberals. These are people who just love this music and love the band and really cared about what happened to one of their icons.
All right, let's go to David Horowitz in Los Angeles. David, your job here tonight is to play The Grinch Who Stole Christmas. Millions of fans gain joy and happiness from listening to the Grateful Dead, including Republican stockbrokers, senators, United States senators, prosecutors. What did they do? What did Jerry Garcia do that was so terrible?
Well, I have to say I like Dead music myself.
You're here under false pretenses.
No, we used to, yeah, well, I can make a distinction between the art and the lives. They were a cultural symbol, and as a cultural symbol, there's a lot that's regrettable. I mean, 3 members of the band are dead from self-abuse, from substance abuse. The band, began with Ken Kesey and the whole LSD culture. And our whole society and millions of people have paid a terrible price for the easy promotion of drugs that, that went on in the 60s, and for levels of tolerance in our society today that are way, way too high, in my view. I think that we are an incredibly tolerant society, and we've just paid a price for it. Part of me admires Senator Leahy for being that he is a senator, for coming on and in any way associating himself with a drug addict. But part of me also says, well, maybe our public figures should, be the stuffed shirts and say no.
Yeah, well, thanks for the admiration, but I don't associate myself with a drug addict. Maybe you do. I don't. I don't believe in doing drugs. I never have done drugs. Maybe you have. You have to speak for yourself on that. I'm not associating myself with drug addiction or anything else, to make that very clear. I'm associating myself with music that has given me and members of my family a great deal of pleasure for years, as it has millions of other Americans.
David Horowitz.
I just was referring to Senator Leahy, just saying he admired the man. I mean, I think admiring the art is one thing. He seemed like a nice man on, when you saw him in the videos and so forth. I'm not, I can't make a harsh judgment here. I personally think that government does more to promote immorality in our society and the problems that we face than popular music.
I think it's important to remember that this is an artist we're talking about. If we disowned every artist who ever had problems in their personal life, many of them cultural conservatives, what would we be listening to, or what paintings would we be looking at, or what theater would we be going to? Not all artists are like that, of course, but you can't judge a person's work by problems that they're having in their life, or even whether or not they're a good person.
We're not arguing about the influence by virtue of the foibles as individuals. We're talking about the fact that as a cultural symbol, and as in fact a very defining component of our culture, they defined a lifestyle which endorsed, promoted use of LSD, endorsed the utilization of drugs, and in fact cultivated a groupies that followed them across the country, actively participating in
Many
that
of those
cultural
groupies
structure.
following them across the country are these Wall Street brokers that we just talked about. They did the furthest thing from endorsing drugs.
You don't know what relationship the particular life component they had at that time had to this group.
John, I can imagine people saying, taking your same position about Liszt and Chopin and Tchaikovsky and a whole lot of other people who had wild lifestyles.
Billie Holiday was
It is no surprise to anyone to take a look at the reporting that followed the concerts, that followed the movement of the tour across the country, and discussed the relationship of the group itself, the Grateful Dead itself, to those following with it, to the endorsement of a culture and a style that is defined by Haight-Ashbury and where they came out of. You're not trying to say that we ought to pretend there was no relationship between the Grateful Dead and the drug culture of the 60s.
There is no relationship between what these people did in their individual lives and what you're saying they endorsed. What they endorsed was a kind of free-thinking quality. They made no prescriptions for other people's lives. They made no apologies for their own. Someone like Jerry Garcia, the furthest thing from his mind would be to encourage somebody to use drugs or discourage them. He wanted people to make their own informed decisions. He knew he wasn't setting any example. This guy's been in and out of hospitals.
I don't think the issue is Jerry Garcia. I mean, the issue is what attitude we as a society take towards drug abuse, such as the Grateful Dead is, symbolic of.
So I understand. What would you have us do? Not listen to the Grateful Dead, or what? I don't understand what your point is, David. What's the prescription coming out of all this?
It's a subtle internal thing that has to change. We have Darryl Strawberry, who is a drug addict, I don't know. There are other charges against him, who's just been given a huge salary to become a hero to young people in New York. Now, there was a time in this country, on the other hand, say Pete Rose, who associated with gamblers, has been kicked out of the Hall of Fame and so forth. We have some kind of weird double standard here. And we need to, we adopt a more negative attitude towards icons, that set a bad example.
So what should the attitude of a right-thinking person have been towards Jerry Garcia? You say you liked his music. Should you not have listened to his music, or should you listen to his music in secret without letting anyone know so that it wouldn't be a bad cultural influence, or what? I don't understand what you want.
Well, like I say, I don't really feel that Jerry Garcia himself is the person that I would, single out. He was a fairly benign, human being in terms of the rest of us. He was not.
To concentrate on the drug use is to isolate one element in his experience. This is a person who in many ways embodied the best of American capitalism.
But let me give the Senator, before we go to break, let me give the Senator a chance to define from your perspective where you draw the line between the music, the individual, and the endorsement of the culture, amongst those three.
As far as the culture is concerned, I defined that in my years as a prosecutor by sending a lot of people involved with dealing drugs to prison. That's how I define that. The music, I define the music as something I enjoyed very, very much and will continue to enjoy. I agree with what Mr. DeCurtis said. There is a spontaneity to it that you would get, not in recordings, but you would get at the concerts. That's what people came for. They came for the spontaneity. Some people did drugs, just as some people drink alcohol. And if they were doing it illegally, that's wrong. But what was appealing to people was the spontaneity of the music, the fact that it would change from concert to concert, and the music was many, many times brilliant.
We'll be back in a minute. When we do, we'll ask what's in the future for the Grateful Dead.
When they come to take you down, when they bring your way down, when they all drag your poor body down.
Army buddy is now a witness for the prosecution as Timothy McVeigh faces a grand jury indictment. How will the Oklahoma bombing suspect defend himself? His attorney tells us tonight on Larry King Live 9 Eastern on CNN.
You know how they say Bob Marley and John Lennon were kind of like prophets? Jerry Garcia was one too.
Oh, he's a legend. What can you say? He's awesome. He'll just go on and on forever. He's not dead.
Welcome back to Crossfire. We're talking about the death of Jerry Garcia of the Grateful Dead and whether his legacy is really worth celebrating. Our guests are Anthony Curtis, a correspondent for VH1 Music Network, David Horowitz of the Center for the Study of Popular Culture, and Senator Patrick Leahy, a Democrat from Vermont.
David Horowitz, I think you're right that you can't really separate Jerry Garcia from the counterculture the way you could say, well, Van Gogh had his problems, but he was still a great artist. Clearly, the counterculture was part of what Jerry Garcia was about, part of his popularity. But isn't the point that the counterculture wasn't all bad and wasn't all a matter of people ruining their lives on drugs, that it had brought a lot of happiness to people, and it still is a major influence on many good people to do many good things?
Well, I always liked the music, Michael. I have, come not to like the message. One thing about the Deadheads was that getting high, was part of the culture, of their culture. And it was a kind of a religious cult, or has been. I mean, one of the amazing things about the band is that its survivability. It never really had, chart hits. But it grossed something like $50 million just a couple of years ago on tour. It had a huge... I think it was a religious phenomenon, these Deadheads going from station to station to station and concerts. But isn't that a good thing? It gave meaning to their lives. It made peace and love
There's nothing wrong with peace and love, is there?
Well, if you, you know, the recent reports are that there's not so much love, you know, in the groups. There's been a lot of violence and bad drug dealing. You know, I think that the 60s looked for a simple way out. The 60s, one of the messages of the 60s was that you never grow old. And I think that the tragic death of Jerry Garcia, because he was really a young man and prematurely old and prematurely dead.
In the 60s, 53 wouldn't have seemed very young, but from the perspective of the 90s, it seems pretty young. You're right.
Great to me, Mike. Anthony DeCurtis, let me ask you, beyond his music, how do you think Jerry Garcia would want to be remembered?
He was somebody, you know, I did the last Rolling Stone cover story on Garcia, and one of the things that he talked about was he never really thought about the future that way. He created his work and wanted it to go on, but never really had a sense of, you know, I hope that people are listening to this, you know, in the future. I think that there's a sense that if people go to it modestly, go to it with the same kind of sense of openness and freedom that he approached it, that's what he would want. He'd want people to be equally creative, not to kind of sit around and just listen to his stuff, but to find ways to express themselves in their own lives that were equally valuable to them.
Pat Leahy, do you think he had a legacy in mind besides his music?
No, I think that well, there were other things he did. He was an artist. He did
neckties.
Well, he did neckties too. In fact, I'm wearing one. But he also did a lot of sketches, painting, some of which had been shown in very prestigious art galleries. Published some books on that. But I think it was I felt anyway, the music was the thing. And I think that the band didn't go out to make very commercial recordings. It was the music that they would perform, actually doing it.
Can the band survive without Jerry? And will they attempt to?
I don't know. Only they can answer that. These are extremely accomplished musicians, all those who were with him, and they will survive as musicians. Whether they will want to do something different or not, I don't know. Obviously, Jerry Garcia was a unique person in his music.
Anthony DeCurtis, do you think the band is going to try to survive without Jerry?
I think all of the members of the band have active solo careers. We're going to see a lot of music coming out of them. I think it's just too soon to say. They probably are so shocked at this point. Garcia would be very difficult to replace. This is really somebody who was at the very heart of the band. You know, somebody who was its kind of symbolic presence, its kind of spiritual leader. The idea of finding someone to fill that role, it's hard to imagine that happening, but I think only time will tell.
Anthony, we heard someone saying, just as we came back from the last commercial, a dead fan saying, he's not really dead. Now, it wasn't very long after Elvis died that people were starting to literally say he hadn't died, and it was clearly a sign of the cultural force he was, that some people to this day believe that Elvis is still alive.
Well,
is that kind of thing going to happen? Is there going to be a cult around him like that?
Garcia was such a smiling and benign presence. It's lovely to think that he'll still be with us, but I'm afraid that will, like Elvis, only be in our hearts, and I don't think we're going to be encountering Jerry at the 7-Eleven anytime soon.
David Horowitz, how much of an impact how much of a different impact to different generations did the Grateful Dead have in terms of the cultural impacts? They obviously had an impact in the 60s, an impact in the 70s, and an impact in the 80s. How different were each of those decades of impact?
Well, you know, I think there are probably two sets of Dead fans, you know, by now. There are some people who are still locked in the 60s past, as you can, you know, see on the tape. There are lots of people who are financial analysts and U.S. senators who are followers of the Dead, you know, who have gone on to new lives. To me, you know, what this really symbolizes is that the 60s are over, and it's time for those people who are still locked in them to grow up.
Are you going to, if the 60s are over, you're out of business. You've been living off the 60s.
Now.
So you're going to go on to other decades too, David?
I hope that the 60s are over soon. I don't see it.
Senator, is it true that Orrin Hatch called you out of a meeting yesterday to tell you that Jerry Garcia had died?
Something actually had that wrong. It was Luke Albee, my chief of staff, who called me out. I was in a press conference with Orrin Hatch. It was a piece of Hatch Leahy. Now, there's something to give you a thought. Hatch-Leahy legislation we were introducing.
That's an oxymoron.
No, it's on law
Peace and love. You see what Jerry Garcia's legacy is?
But the irony is, Jerry Garcia would be watching this with great bemusement, even seeing this show, this kind of analysis.
Absolutely.
He'd say, what are they talking
A
about?
lot of people are watching this with amusement. Thanks, Senator Leahy. Thank you, David Horowitz. Thank you, Anthony DeCurtis.
Thank you.
John and I will bemuse each other in just a moment.
I love great art, you know, and poetry, you know. I mean, all the things that enrich human life are things that I like, you know. There's tons of music that I love, you know, and I mean, I don't really think I'm going to be able to get around to everything that I potentially love in this lifetime.
Well, I never thought I'd hear John Sununu utter the words, "Will the band survive the loss of Jerry?"
The fact is, Mike, that Pat Leahy notwithstanding, this group had an influence on kids that unfortunately encouraged a lot of them to use LSD. A lot of young people died because they believed in this band. He may have been a great musician and a great artist, but the Grateful Dead represented a lot of the worst that came out of Haight-Ashbury.
John, a lot of people of every generation wrecked their lives, and I don't think you can blame the Grateful Dead for a single one that I know of.
I think they gave credibility to a practice that just hurt a lot of people.
From the left, I'm Mike Kinsley. Good night for Crossfire.
And from the right, I'm John Sununu. Join us again tomorrow night for another edition of Crossfire.